Thank you. It's really an honor to be here with you today. Wonderful. So we're going to use this next hour and a half to really dive deeply into the notions of empathy and resilience and look at how the Roots of Empathy program may be doing a very profound service, not only for the kids who are fortunate enough to be in the program, but for the communities that those children will either directly be a part of or even indirectly influence. So what I'd like to do is just to begin with this photograph here. Can everyone see it? Yeah? So this is a photograph taken clearly at a day of Roots of Empathy. And how many of you have actually had the opportunity to be at a Roots of Empathy classroom experience? Raise your hand. So it's about 3/4 of us. Okay. So we had the opportunity yesterday to go to a school here in Toronto. Did I say that right? Or is it Toronto? So, Toronto, I think is how you say it. And to be in a classroom just like this, actually, where you see this incredible moment of the children in the classroom who are getting to know this baby and the mom as this baby grows for the first year of life. So if you just look at the photograph and go, oh, that's really cute, and that's fine, but we're going to say beyond cute, there's profound things that are happening here, not just in this moment, but for all the moments that will unfold in these children's lives. So I'd like to just take that apart piece by piece. And as we go through why this experience is so profound, what I'd like to do is just give you a framework on where this is coming from. So you heard in the bio, I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry, but actually the world I work in is a field called interpersonal neurobiology. And that's a term that I had to make up because what I was doing back in the late 80s and early 90s didn't have a name, and it was basically saying this: if you combined all the fields of science together, so if you took anthropology studying culture, and sociology studying our interaction in groups, and linguistics for how we use language to speak to each other, and psychology for studies of memory and attention and behavior, and biology, including medicine and psychiatry, where you study the functions of the body and what gives rise to life, and chemistry, how molecules interact with each other. I'm trained as a biochemist. Or getting down to physics even, how properties of the universe govern how things happen. And then even get to another level, mathematics. What would happen if you took everything from math to anthropology and saw the common ground among all those fields? So that was an effort that I became obsessed with in the beginning of the decade of the brain, the early 90s, because people were saying something that Hippocrates had said since 2,500 years ago, that the mind is basically only coming from your head, that the mind was just brain activity. And then William James, the grandfather of modern psychology, reaffirmed that in 1890 in a book called The Principles of Psychology. But for me, as a trained psychotherapist, it just seemed to be only part of a much bigger picture. And in my field, a branch of medicine, psychiatry, people were being reduced to bags of chemicals and being told you are a depressive or you are a schizophrenic. And the attitude among many of my colleagues was that these names that were being given were telling the whole story. And of course, there were a number of things that pushed psychiatry in that direction. The idea to have this nomenclature called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and things like that, or insurance companies saying, yeah, we only take people who are going to be treated for brief periods of time on these medications, or the medication industry, or even the identity crisis that my field in psychiatry had, which was, how are we really different from anybody else, So we prescribe medication. So there were lots of forces at work at the decade of the brain that fit with the science that basically said mind is a synonym for brain activity. So part of why I give you that background is because you can hear a lot of conviction by really smart people, scientists, that actually may not correlate with its accuracy. So is mind just the activity of the brain? Is it just a word meaning the same thing? So I brought all these scientists together from all these fields I'm speaking about, and we tried to ask the question, what is the relationship between the mind and the brain? And that's a whole nother long story, but what I'm about to tell you about roots of empathy comes from this effort beginning in the early 90s that ultimately we called interpersonal neurobiology, which is to say, what happens in the betweenness, like right here, what's happening in the betweenness, the inter, and what's happening with the withinness, the personal, and then how can we understand that scientifically? So I just use the term neurobiology, but the idea is that there's something much more than just something going on in the brain. The brain's really important, but to limit the mind and mental life to just the brain is actually, I think, scientifically inaccurate, even though it's been around for 2,500 years. Even though it's over 90% of academics will say that to you, and maybe some of you are from academics and want to jump up and say, you're reversing science or something like that. But I think what has hampered science is by equating mind with brain. So in interpersonal neurobiology, we don't do that. So you can say, if you look at the bottom of this thing, roots of empathy, its mission is to build caring, peaceful, and civil societies. So if you're looking at societies, you're going to look at culture, right? So you need to understand anthropology and sociology, and that the mind is coming from the betweenness as much as the withinness, to understand that part of the sentence. Through the development, so we have to understand development, which is what we'll talk about today. Through development, whoops, let me move this back without breaking it, so you can see over there. So right now I'm thinking about the mental experience of you guys on that table, and you're not seeing the photograph, so I'm going to try to move it, but there are wires. Can you see it now? Okay, but that probably looks terrible for everyone else, so my daughter would say, you should have made it aesthetically pleasing. Okay, so through the development, so we need to understand that, of this word empathy, right? And empathy is an interesting word. So even just in terms of linguistics, we have to be very careful of the words we use. Because some of you may know that empathy is getting a bad rap in a number of fields in the last 2 to 3 years. Have anyone heard these anti-empathy things? So an anti-empathy person sitting in this room would go, oh God, they are really doing a bad thing. Or like I wrote a book for teenagers called Brainstorm, where I was encouraging the development of empathy. And one of my reviewers wrote, you're really not up on the current science. Empathy has been proven to be bad. So you're encouraging a bad thing. Literally, that was the note. So I wrote back to the reviewer and I said, please tell me more about your feelings about it being a bad thing. And she wrote, you're obviously not aware of the work of Tanya Singer, who's a neurobiology researcher in Germany. So I said, actually, I'm very aware of her work, but thank you for your input. So then a few months later, actually a few years later, I was teaching in Berlin, and Tanya Singer was one of the people on the stage with me. So I said, Tanya, I need to get this straight from you. People are quoting you, telling me that when I encourage empathy, just like Roots of Empathy encourages it, that I'm doing a bad thing. So I'm going to just leave that in the room. We're going to come back to what Tanya said because it won't make any sense until I explain everything else. But you'll see what she said. And in children and adults. So this is the idea that we're going to explore from an interpersonal neurobiology point of view. So to do that can get a little weird. So luckily, the Marys have given you safety belts to put on your chairs because we're going to actually explore a lot of stuff that is stuff that you often don't hear, but it's really worth taking the ride to see, I think, the bigger picture of things. So if you're taking notes, I'm going to try to highlight the take-home points. If you don't want to take notes, much of this stuff is in these various books that you heard about. Mind would be a good place to see the wild ride of it. Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology would get the fundamental points. A book called Mindsight, you'd see some of the elements. And Brainstorm is the book for adolescents to develop empathy. So there's a lot written on it. We have all sorts of online training and stuff like that. So there's lots of stuff. This is going to be like a highlights time. But it goes like this. If you say, these children, the roots of empathy, the kids in the classroom, are having an experience that's going to change them, right? If you just take that statement, that this intervention, roots of empathy, for a child who gets to experience, is going to alter their development. Just take that basic statement. Would everyone agree that that's why it's being done, right? Who agrees with that? That sounds about right. Okay, half the people. Okay, very good. All right, so I've got to convince the other half. An intervention, the reason to do it is it influences somebody in some way. So the first thing we have to ask is, how does that happen? Like, how does an experience, bless you, bless you. Let's have a bless you for everyone who's going to sneeze. Bless you. So how does that happen that this young boy, having this experience over the year, is going to be different if you study the outcomes, that he'd be different? Or that baby, what's your baby's name? Jude? So Jude is going to have a certain kind of experience. I don't want to put pressure on you, based on what her mom does with her, yeah? His, okay. I was thinking of Hey Jude, but this is a different Jude. So based on what his mom is going to do, right? So we have an actual example, a photograph example, and then the idea of roots of empathy. So what actually is happening there? That this child gets to spend time in a roots of empathy program, or Jude is interacting with his mom like he's doing right now. What's actually happening there? It's a connection. It's a connection, exactly. What is, if you were a Martian dropping down from Mars, coming to this planet, right? And you have your own Martian thing that you do, but you're just a careful observer called a scientist. That's what a scientist is, observing, right? And you're observing this happening here, or observing Jude with his mom. What would you actually be observing? What is it that's happening? So there's eye contact, right? You can see this baby, let's call him Jude too, baby Jude here, is looking right into the eyes of this student, right? So there's eye contact. And what is eye contact? And it's, if you're a Martian and you don't have words like eye contact, what would you actually be observing? What's that? It's a communication, exactly, but you don't have a word called communication, but you'd be observing communication. And what is this eye contact communication made of? What's that? Emotion. So you don't have a word for emotion, you know. So, but but we could say it's emotion because we experience it from the inside out. But if you were a Martian watching this, and you didn't have a word for emotion, what would you actually see? Now, this is not an easy exercise, but let me just say this: it's an essential exercise. So I'm trained as an attachment researcher. So after I trained in psychiatry, I wanted to know, and child psychiatry, I wanted to know how does a healthy mind develop. So back in the late 80s, I chose to get a National Institute of Mental Health Research Fellowship to study attachment. And even though all my academic advisors said that's like the stupidest thing you could do for your academic career, I said, why? They said, well, no pharmaceutical industry is going to pay for you. You're not going to be able to get tenure because, you know, no one's really interested in attachment. You want to study diseases and all this kind of stuff. I said, well, no one's talking about, first of all, what the mind is. No one's even talking about a healthy mind, and that's what I'm going to do. So, you know, they were trying to be helpful, but it just showed you the nature of the thing. So in attachment terms, you know, we might say, oh, this is the development of some kind of exploration that's a part of the secure attachment this baby has with his mom, or Jude is developing a secure attachment. But even that, for me, with my attachment teachers, didn't feel like it was enough. What's actually happening, if you're a Martian, is you would be seeing, in this case, an exchange of photons. I'm getting deep here, right, in terms of physics. You'd basically be an exchange of energy that would be both light and sound. And this becomes an extremely important place to start. And I know it's weird, but it's important to start there. It's an exchange of light and sound, and communication can be defined as the exchange of energy. And some energy has symbolic, does not have symbolic value, and some has symbolic value, like the term empathy is a symbol. So it turns out that communication is the sharing of energy some forms of energy are symbolic, and we call that information. And because it changes, we have the word flow. So there's a phrase we're going to use over and over and over again, which is energy and information flow. So you as a Martian would be seeing that unlike this kid who would be studying history or math, those are important, but unlike those things of ideas and concepts, this child in this classroom is having an energy and information flow exchange that is profoundly different from most everything else he's going to have in that classroom. And when we were in the classroom yesterday and we were asking, we observed a young class, what were they, third graders? What were they yesterday? Fourth graders in one class, and then we went to an 8th grade class and then interviewed those kids. The interviews I'll tell you about were just profound to hear what these kids who had had roots of empathy many times, what they could say about the impact of roots of empathy on their development. But basically what they experienced was an immersion in energy and information flow of a different kind. Now, the reason to start there is because you can say that experience is driving energy and information flow through your nervous system, if you want to get brainy on us. And in fact, that's exactly what the brain is all about. It's about patterns of energy flow that are called neural representations when they are representing something, which they usually are. So the phrase energy and information flow is something that happens not only between us, it's what experience is and it's what relationships are, but it's happening inside the whole body, especially the brain. So what we've just identified is a very important take-home point, which is what the brain shares with relationships is energy and information flow. And I know no one talks like this, and my students say, this is weird, no one's talking like us, and you're teaching us to be different. I said, well, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of it all, which is that the brain and relationships share energy and information flow. One is within, so it's the whole body, not just what's in the head. The other is between. But what I'm asking you to do to really dive deeply into what Roots of Empathy does is to consider that energy and information flow is the shared common ground. So we're going to talk about empathy in a moment and resilience, and you'll hear from Michael later today. Yeah, later today. You know, Michael, you may not use the terms that I'm using, but we had a lovely talk at dinner last night about the overlap of this stuff. So, okay, so the energy and information flow that is being driven through this boy, the student's brain, if you want to just go brain now on us, is a very different sort. He's got to pick up nonverbal signals from that baby. There are 7 nonverbal signals that we know about. Eye contact, facial expression, I'm going to have you repeat after me soon, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, intensity. So let's do that together. You ready? Because these are good to memorize because they're often left out of school. So let's do this together. You ready? You point to your eyes, you say eye contact. You circle your face, you say facial expression. Point to your voice box, you say tone of voice. Point to your posture and say posture. Gesture and say gesture. Point to where your wristwatch is or what might be and say timing. And then make some fists and say intensity. Now you do it. You ready? Yeah, give yourself a hand. That's great. Those are often not the overt curriculum, but in Roots of Empathy, they are the starting place. Picking up nonverbal signals is essential to know what the inner subjective experience is of self or other. To know the inner life of self or other requires these nonverbal signals. And if you were a Martian dropping in to Earth, you'd say, wow, they really either pay attention to Roots of Empathy to nonverbal signals, or wow, here's a classroom without Roots of Empathy. They're not paying any attention to those things, right? Because they're processed in very different areas of the brain, actually. And we're not going to worry about which areas right at this moment, but just say that people who have parents who tune in, so I'm an attachment researcher, this is what we study, Children who have parents like Jude here, whose mom is tuned into those nonverbal signals, have kids who develop a very different set of outcomes. And I'll have you consider, they become resilient. These nonverbal signals are the essence of how a baby communicates in the first year of life before linguistic symbols come in. And we don't have to worry about, nonverbal signals are primarily in the right and linguistic symbols are primarily on the left. That happens to be true. We don't even need to worry about that. You can make a big deal out of that, but in neuroscience, people don't like you to make a big deal of it. They think it's overstated, and you don't even have to go there for this to be true. Okay, it happens to be a lot of evidence about it. It's primarily right hemisphere, and that Jude's right hemisphere is developing in the first 1 to 2 years of life. It's dominant in activity and growth. But just put that aside, because it's not what you need to have to understand this. So this boy in the classroom is having the stimulation of areas of his brain that are taking in nonverbal signals. And then the facilitator, I don't know where she is, but the facilitator or the mom are then taking it the next step. They're asking the children in the classroom to reflect with words on what the little baby Jude here, what he's experiencing. So yesterday, the facilitator said, well, what do you think is going on? Oh, he feels really uncomfortable. He's a little nervous. He's kind of a little scared. Then a toy was presented. Oh, he's kind of interested. He's focusing his attention, and he has the intention to actually play with that ball, right? So look at all those words I just mentioned. He's feeling this, that, or that, so feelings. His attention, where his attention is, and his intention. Now you may say, well, this is so subtle. Who cares about this? Here's the reason to think about it. When you look at evolution and understand different forays into consciousness, which is really, when we talk about creating a peaceful and civil society, we're talking about transforming the consciousness of humanity in communities. When you look at the science of consciousness, and this is not a separate topic, it's the topic, but people usually don't put them together. Here's what we know. 2 leading brain theories of consciousness. One involves the idea that the more integrated this child's brain is, the more capacity for consciousness this child will have. And we'll talk about integration later on, but it's basically how you're linking different stuff together within the brain. So there's the integrated information theories of Tononi and all sorts of other people, Christoph Koch, Gerald Edelman, all sorts of folks have posited that, about integration of the brain is related to consciousness. That's fine. Another set of theories is called the social brain theory of consciousness, and it goes like this. We, as mammals, are extremely social. We as primates have very complex social hierarchies, and we as human beings, mammals who are primates, and now Homo sapiens, the ones who know and know we know, we have this very unusual history that you may not be aware of, but it's called alloparenting. Allo is A-L-L-O, means other. Alloparenting means that Jude's attachment capacity, attachment is a mammalian capacity to link with a care provider. Usually in mammals and almost all primates, it's just with the mom, but not human beings. With human beings, we raise children in communities where we as human beings evolved where the caregiver is not just the mother. And what that means is that this alloparenting that Sarah Hrdy, H-R-D-Y, anthropologist, writes beautifully about in her book, Mothers and Others, that this isn't just, some subtle little thing. This may have been a profound influence on how we evolved. We evolved to be collaborative. So what the social brain theory says is that what likely happened is that first we had to know the mind of the other. I've got to know Mary's mind. So I'm going to look at her nonverbal signals, and I'm going to have to figure out, if I have a baby, am I going to give my baby to Mary or not? What's her intention? Where's her attention going? What are her emotions? What is she thinking? Right? So in this theory, the first step in evolution is actually to know another mind. Now, what's the evidence for that? The evidence for that is if you look at the circuitry of knowing other minds, and you look at areas, if you like to know the names, I always am nervous about saying these Greek names because people get all glassy-eyed. But if you want to know the names, we're talking about the superior temporal sulcus and the temporal parietal junction, just as examples. These are areas of the brain that whenever we try to know another person, they get super activated. They're the areas, for example, that track what's called biological motion. You say, well, why would the brain have an area that's tracking biological motion of a living thing versus just a rock rolling down a hill? The reason is living entities have intentions. They have essentially mental states that drive their behavior. And so you want to know what's the mental state so you can actually predict the behavior. That's why we have these areas I'm mentioning. Here's the key thing. If you get a stroke in those areas, your consciousness of yourself is massively assaulted. So there's an overlap between, quote, and I don't like using this word, but self-awareness, and you'll see later on why I don't like self-awareness, but this idea of awareness of your inner life and your awareness of another person's mind are essentially identical circuits. That is a hugely important issue for Roots of Empathy, to understand why it's such an important program. What I just said to summarize all that is one of the leading theories of consciousness is that we use the social circuits of our brain for consciousness of the self. So in other words, awareness of my own mind and awareness of your mind are basically the same circuitry. Now we've got to differentiate them so I know it's Mary and not me and whatever. I mean, so that's important, but it starts from this same origin. So when you have a kid in a classroom, or let's start with Jude here. Let's say Jude's mother was not interested in his internal state, didn't respond to these nonverbal signals. You could posit then that developmentally, Jude would have an experience where his capacity for self-awareness, because the mother is stimulating those circuits of connection, didn't happen, his capacity for self-awareness is much lower. And in fact, if you look at my field, attachment research, that's exactly what we found. Kids with avoidant attachment have this kind of distant thing. It's about 20% of the population, and it's a distant way in which parents are not tuned into their internal world, and they don't have much self-awareness. It's remarkable. And we can study that in something called the adult attachment interview later on, where you can actually get a sense of how aware is a person of self or other. And there's a very thin kind of depth of awareness. So this is likely why, because what's happening here in Roots of Empathy, or what's happening now between Jude and his mom, is these moments of, we're calling them connection, but they're deep, nonverbal resonance, if you will, allow you to have this experience, which one of my patients described a long time ago, and I can't think of a better phrase than what she came up with, and I want to quote her. I can see her right now because she's in me. You know, she said when she got better in therapy, and I had no idea why because I didn't do what my supervisors told me to do. So at the end of therapy, I said, you know, here at UCLA, we have an exit interview to talk about what happened. She goes, oh, that's a great idea. She was a graduate student. I said, yeah, so what do you think happened here now that you're better from your depression and suicidal thoughts? She goes, oh, it's obvious. So I said, yeah, I know it's obvious. I said, but how would you put words to it if you had to put words to it? She said, never before in my life have I ever had the experience of feeling felt. And that phrase, for me, changed everything. This fantastic graduate student could articulate what happened in the therapy, but it's also what happens just in life. You know, when you're with someone and you feel felt, you feel that your internal world is being received by the other, made sense of the other, but not just in an intellectual way, in a deep way we're going to call empathy. You know, empathy has 5 facets to it. It actually has more than that, but I can only remember 5. There are actually, if you read a book called The Neurobiology of Empathy, the lead editor on that is Jean Decety, D-E-C-E-T-Y. The first or second chapter in that book is written by someone, one of the contributors, but he describes 8 forms of empathy. But I'm going to tell you about 5 of them, which I think are most relevant. And it's why I get so upset when people quote Tanya Singer and say empathy is bad. Because that statement is so uninformed, because you have to say to the person, excuse me, there are 8 kinds of empathy. Which of those, or are you saying all of them are bad? What are you saying? So here are the kinds of empathy that I think are relevant for roots of empathy to know about. One, which is what Tanya Singer had studied, and she's in Germany, and it's just maybe an English translation, I don't know, but she studied the first thing we're going to talk about, which is called emotional resonance. Emotional resonance, or empathic resonance, if you want to keep on using the word empathy there, is where this boy, if let's say the baby is feeling excited, the receiver, having an empathic communication, will start feeling excited. Let's say the boy is feeling scared. The receiver will feel scared. It's the essence of feeling felt, right? Is empathic resonance. And I'll go through the circuitry of that with you through the brain a little later on, but just let's name it. Empathic resonance is where you feel the feelings of another person. Empathy form number 2 is perspective taking. You know, so if you're going to be empathic with me, it would be as if you were saying, let me put myself in Dan's skin. Let me put myself in Dan's glasses, you know, seeing the world as I would see the world. So it's perspective taking. And you can study these things. These are all studyable things, but they're different. Empathic resonance and perspective taking, they're just different, but they're both what we call empathy. Well, which one's bad, you know? So perspective taking is where the teacher says, what do you think he's seeing? You know, what's his experience? Well, he's seeing that toy is too far away, or it was too upsetting for him because there was too much noise. So they're taking his perspective, and we saw that yesterday. It's beautiful, perspective taking. Imagine a world where even if we just did perspective taking, what a different world that would be, right? So perspective taking. The next one is called cognitive empathy. It's where you elaborate a little more, and the teachers did this beautifully yesterday in both classrooms, where you say, okay, if you're a little, 9-month-old, and you're a little tired because your nap didn't go so well, and now you're in the classroom, even though you know the kids, and you're a little clinging onto mom, and then a loud noise happens, what do you think that means for little Jude? So now you're going, well, I think it means he's probably remembering that last time he was in the classroom, there was another loud noise, and then a really scary thing happened, so maybe he's remembering how frightening it was, and so now he's getting even more frightened. So it's more than just his perspective of what his perception is at this moment. It's realizing that memory influences him, and that memory and emotion and these judgments we make all influence our present moment experience. That's called cognitive empathy. Really important. You could call it empathic understanding if you want to use that word, but it's sometimes called cognitive empathy. So what do we have here? Let's name it. Emotional resonance. We've got perspective taking. We have cognitive empathy, right? Then you have something called empathic concern, which is basically a synonym for compassion. Empathic concern is basically this: I feel your pain, and I want to do something to reduce your suffering. And now I'm going to think about what I might do and carry it out. So I was just in England with Paul Gilbert, and Paul is one of the world's experts on compassion. And basically, that whole field of compassion is a form of empathic concern. They're synonyms. So we have a word compassion, but it's actually the same as empathic concern. But the key thing about compassion or empathic concern is that you're feeling the suffering of another, step one. So you have to receive it. So when people shut themselves off from that, they're shutting off empathic concern. Then they have to take the suffering and then say, wow, there's a lot of suffering in you. I feel really bad with that. So that's step 2. Then you go into empathic imagination. That's not one of the categories, but we can just name it. Empathic imagination. I go, wow, what could I do now to make you feel better? Okay, I could just be with you, or I could bring you some water because you're really so thirsty, or I could get you a Band-Aid if you've fallen down, or whatever. So now I imagine how I would carry out an action to be of service to you. And then, depending on the circumstances, I actually do something. But sometimes you can't, but that's okay. Sometimes just being with a person is fine. So compassion or empathic concern, synonyms, is an action-oriented form of empathy. So that's number 4. And then number 5 is something we hardly ever talk about, which is called empathic joy. And you saw every one of these were seen in the classroom yesterday. It was so beautiful, right? Empathic joy is, I get so excited about your success. I am so happy. In this case, these kids are seeing this little Jude develop over the time, and they're so thrilled about his accomplishments. Now he can sit up. Wow. Now he can crawl. Whoa. We're putting the ball up there. He's going after his mom. She went on the other side. It was awesome to see the empathic joy. It's one of the most underemphasized empathic skills that we have. Is there a question? Yes. So empathic joy, yeah. So in a way, it overlaps with emotional resonance. In fact, they all overlap with emotional resonance. You could say you can't have the other 4 without emotional resonance, but you got to resonate with someone's pain. You got to all those things. But it's different in the sense that emotional resonance is I'm just feeling your feelings. Empathic joy is I am thrilled with your, basically your positive experience. A lot of people have Schadenfreude, right? They get upset with other people's success. So this is the opposite of that. This is where, the way I was going to say that the way you do this is you can imagine life as a candle, right? The way our modern culture sets things up, and this came up, there's a few public high schools in California that are right near Stanford University. And sadly, a number of the high school kids were throwing themselves in front of the train and killing themselves. So they asked me to go do an intervention. And when I went to the school, some of the students interviewed me, and they asked if they could film it, so the students filmed it, and they did such a good job filming it, we just put it up online. So if you go to my website, drdansiegel.com, you can see me speaking, and the camera will be on me, so you won't see the terrified looks on the kids' faces, or their parents who are in the room's faces, or the teachers, or the administrators, the principals of the school were there. But you'll at least see my face, and you'll see me resonating with them. So at the end, what I said was, part of the problem with our culture of competition is that we have this attitude where if we're candles, and my wick is lit, and your wick is lit, I'm going to do everything I can to blow out your wick, so I'm like the only candle shining. So when I apply to middle school and can get into that elite middle school, or I'm going to apply to college and get into the elite college, I'm going to be the one that shines through, Or when I'm applying to the most competitive graveyard, I'll get in there first, And I said that this is a serious problem in our society. Other people's being lit up threatens us. So it's the opposite of this empathic joy. So what I said was, imagine a world where if your wick is lit and you see someone next to you whose wick is not lit, like someone's not learning or they're not figuring out how to be in life and stuff, and you lean over and you light their wick, and then you come straighten out again, and now both of you are lit up, and then you see someone to your left, their wick is not lit, you lean over, you light their wick. And now I said to the group listening, what did that do to my flame to light up these other 2 candles? And they go, nothing. It took nothing away. And then one of the moms in the room who had been looking very frightened before, she goes, but it makes the world a brighter place. And that's what empathic joy is. You say, listen, and we'll get to this soon, the notion of the self being defined by the boundaries of the skin, just like the mind being defined by the boundaries of the skull, these are linguistic parts of our modern culture. It's been around with us in science for 2,500 years. So this is a long-term linguistic, I'm going to suggest to you, lie. And it's a lethal lie. There is no reason that the self needs to be limited by the skin. And yet you may go, that is just weird. Why did the Marys bring this guy up here? That is like so freaky weird. Well, the thing is, if you say that the self comes from the mind, which I think it does, like, where is this boy's mind? It's not just in his head, and it's not just in his body. It's happening now in the classroom. The mind is broader than the brain, and the self is bigger than the skin-encased body. And this is something we don't often talk about. That's why I'm nervous about the word self-awareness or self-regulation or stuff like that. Because self is a plural verb. It's not a singular noun. But we use it as a singular noun. Oh, this Dan, his self is in this body. Well, that's just part of the story. And as long as we live a life and have cultural communication that keeps on repeating the lie, basically it's lethal. It's a lethal lie. It kills the reality, so it's untrue. It kills our sense of belonging in the world. It kills our capacity to actually connect with, quote, others, but really connect with human beings that are actually a part of who we are. It really inhibits our capacity to be a part of community. Because, oh, how am I going to help this self do that? And people, at least in the United States, who experience this are miserable. But no one talks about it. So the mind of this child is actually being created in the betweenness with little Jude and this boy. And that's a kind of connection that doesn't happen just by learning math or reading a book or learning history or something. It just doesn't. And yet it happens in Roots of Empathy. If you would have heard these 8th graders talk about what Roots of Empathy did with them, you could see it allowed them to start sensing the mind of another person. Okay, that's step 1. All 5 forms of empathy we've talked about are reinforced with the Roots of Empathy. But if you then go back to what we said about the social brain theory of consciousness, or even the integration theory we're going to get into now, then what you see is that these experiences of interconnection change your experience of inner awareness. Let's just use that term, inner and inter, rather than self and other. Right? So Joshua was telling us before we got started about, programs where you start being of service to others, where you start being of service to the community, service to nature, scientifically doing things to support a more sustainable environment. Those kids have a much better academic outcome because they have a much better developmental outcome, because they are a part of a larger world. You literally have an expanded experience of life because the true nature of who you are is being realized, because you are connected to that creek. The creek is a part of you. But we don't talk like this because we got these words, self. Well, that doesn't get that self advanced into that elite graveyard. I'm seriously. Okay. So let's go through, let me see if there are any questions about where we're at now. We've now defined empathy. I've got to come to the Tanya Singer story, and now we're going to get a little bit into the brain, and then talk about resilience, empathy, and the brain to dive into that. Any questions so far? Yeah, Jean. Everybody know Jean? Jean Clinton? Yes.
Self is a plural verb.
Yeah. Self is a plural verb, yeah. Yeah, so, I'm kind of a nut about all these different disciplines, but in linguistics, especially because it's how we communicate with each other, you get these fun opportunities to think, like, what are these words doing to us without our even knowing it? So words are both limiting and liberating at the same time. So self as a plural verb versus self as a singular noun, the way it's usually used is, you have a self called Jean that's just you in that body. I have a self called Dan, and it's in this body, right? So those are singular noun views. So linguistically, we don't even question it. We just live it. Okay, well, here's little Danny. My parents say, Danny, get a good grade on the test. Danny, do this. Danny, do that. And I believe them because they love me and they only want good for me, right? So I believe it. But it gets embedded in, let's keep in mind, really, who we are is basically energy and information flow patterns, all right? But it's such a complex thing, we have to make these things called models. And the models, like, who am I? Okay, I'm Dan in this body. The models are represented by words. Then once we hear the words that are coming from the models, the words themselves reinforce the model. So here's this what's called a mental model. It's basically, if you think about it this way, energy and information flow comes to your body. It's energy. That's called sensation. Between sensation and perception, there are models that are filtering sensation into certain organizational structures. So for example, if you've seen a DOG before, a dog, when this fluffy animal comes in, okay, you may have the photons hit your eyes and this fluffy animal's thing wagging is like that, and and then you hear the sound coming into your ears. That's all energy flow. That's sensation. But because you've seen a dog before, many dogs, and you have the name dog, right away that model from sensation before you get to perception is turned into a constricted perceptual model. So you don't actually see that animal in front of you. And you don't even know this is happening. You just call him dog. To be very respectful, but it's a fun story, there's no such thing as immaculate perception. Okay? It is shaped by prior experience and models. So now you have this perceptual model that you think is the thing itself, but it's not. It's your model of the thing. Then you go from perception to cognition, right? Where you have other models that are going in, shaping how you think, right? And then you go from cognition, to planning, from motor action planning, right? And that's full of models that you aren't even aware of. These models are not even in awareness. And then you carry out an action, and you may think you're carrying it out based on what you think you want to do, but it's all sorts of other things going on before consciousness, beneath consciousness. And then you carry out an action. You go there, I am carrying out that action, right? But it's all influenced by these models that get reinforced by our communication with each other, including language. So like in an avoidant attachment, what happens in those families is there is a relational model that the mind doesn't exist, and only behaviors are worth experiencing. So like when I went to medical school, and my professors would tell people, oh, we've gotten your lab data, and I'm sorry to report, but you're dying, goodbye. And I'd pull on their lab coats after they left the room, and I'd say, don't you want to talk to this patient about how she feels? And literally, my professors would say, why? And I would go, what? And they'd go, why would I talk to that person about how she feels? I told her what's going on. I made an assay, basically, of her bodies and her molecules, the physical aspect of this being. Why would I talk about feelings? I go, well, because you just told her she's dying, and she may have feelings about it. She goes, they would say to me over and over again, that's not what doctors do. So I dropped out of school. And when I decided to, and I came to Canada, of course, that's the only place you go when you drop out of school. Traveled across Canada, met a lot of nice Canadians, and I was going to be a salmon fisherman in Vancouver Island. Anyway, I did get picked up when I was hitchhiking. Don't tell my kids I was hitchhiking, but I was hitchhiking. I got picked up on Vancouver Island, and this guy says, well, what's your story? I said, well, I was a medical student, but I dropped out, and I've become a salmon fisherman. He goes, that's amazing. I said, what's so amazing about that? He goes, I am a salmon fisherman, and I'm dropping out to become a psychology professor. And I'm looking for this guy. If anyone knows who it is, I don't know who he is. I said, well, cool. I said, what's it like being a salmon fisherman? He goes, I said I'm dropping out. I said, why? He goes, well, I like playing tennis, but you get up at 4 in the morning, and all you're doing is like this all day long. I can't even stand up straight anymore. I said, oh, my God, I already had a bad back. So I said, okay, you've just saved me many years of salmon fishing. So I decided to do other things. But the bottom line of that story is when I decided to go back to school, I made up this word called mindsight. And I said, look, I imagine those professors probably hadn't changed in the year I took off, so I need a word to protect me. So I went in there kind of like an anthropologist, and I studied how bad they were as care providers, so I could try to constantly in my mind say, does this person have mindsight or not? And then when I was in pediatrics, I noticed the families who had mindsight did better with their kids who had these medical problems, right? They could deal with them in a more resilient way. Mindsight is three things. It's this capacity to have insight into your inner life, empathy for the inner life of another bodily experience, another person. And the third thing is integration, which is this honoring of differences and promoting of linkages we're going to talk about right now. So it was a very helpful term for me, but what I noticed, sadly, was that most of my professors in medical school, who were research professors, I was at a research institution, they had physical sight up the wazoo. They were very famous, renowned researchers doing physical research that could then, they were also MDs, so they were seeing patients, but they didn't have mind sight. You can go through an entire curriculum, K through 12, and be taught physical sight. You can go through college and be just taught physical sight. You can go to medical school like I did and only be taught physical sight. But I used to work on a suicide prevention service in college, and I was taught the way you tune into the mind of the caller on the phone who's about to kill herself can make the difference between life and death. So when I went to medical school, I thought, cool, I'm trained as a biochemist. I'm also trained as a suicide prevention service. Medicine will be where they come together. No way. It didn't happen at all because they lacked mindsight. Now, I'm not going to make any proclamations of understanding that this is true, but as an attachment researcher, what I found out was that 20% of the general population basically lack mindsight. And those are the ones with a history of avoidant attachment. And I'm not saying that that percentage is the same in universities, because maybe it's different in certain directions, right? So, so physical sight and mind sight are just very different circuits in the brain. They're very different circuits in the brain, and you can turn it off like that. It's what genocide is based on. If you start treating someone like an out-group, you can shut off your mind-sight circuits. I used to be the psychiatrist for the survivors of the Shoah Foundation. We collected 55,000 interviews of survivors of the Holocaust. And my job was to keep the staff healthy as best I could, because hearing those stories was unbelievably painful. You got secondary post-traumatic stress disorder. Anyway, part of my job was to go over to Europe and go to the concentration camps where the subjects we were interviewing had been interned, and obviously they survived. But when I was at one of the camps, Medonek in Poland, the person giving me the tour had been a kid in the town. And Medonek, if any of you have been there, is where the crematorium, because they were gassing and then murdering like 6 million people. And this was one of those camps where they did that. It was right next to the apartments where the guards lived. So I said to the tour guide, I said, well, what was it like to live there? He goes, well, you'd be surprised. Those guards were nice people. Like they played with their kids, they played with their dogs, they were nice people. And it made me realize your mind-sight circuitry can be turned off if you look at a person and say, this is a subhuman being. This is like a cockroach. And sadly, we have this in-group, out-group distinction thing that we talked about yesterday in the 8th grade, where, especially if you look at mortality salient studies, or what are called terror management studies, when we're under threat, it increases the brain's in-group, out-group tendencies, and you treat people that you deem as the in-group with more kindness when you're under threat, and you treat people who you deem in the out-group with more harshness. And then our wonderful colleagues from Northern Ireland, you talked about the incredible thing about the Protestants and the Catholics killing each other. Because one of the kids in the classroom who was an African Canadian said, we said, well, what are you guys worried about the world? What would you like to see change? And he goes, how stereotyped people can become. We started talking about racism. And then we were talking about this in-group, out-group distinction, the experience in Ireland. Said, look, with mind sight, you can rise above that because the brain does have this natural proclivity to do in-group, out-group distinction, especially under stress. But we now know the mind can rise above what the brain is doing. This is the key thing to realize about resilience, is that your mind is not the same as your brain. You can develop resilience from communities, you can develop resilience from consciousness that rise above these tendencies we have. So in Roots of Empathy, what you're teaching is you're expanding the consciousness of these kids. I mean, I'm telling you, and luckily it was being taped, when you see the tapes of this discussion, that these Roots of Empathy graduates could talk about wanting to reduce racism, wanting to actually have less violence, wanting to have people respect each other, seeing that it was good to do roots of empathy over and over again, because then you saw from a different perspective as you yourself grew, even though the kid was still, 0 to 1, you yourself saw it through a different lens. And just to see the way these kids of all different nationalities in the school, or ethnic backgrounds in the school, I guess they were all Canadian, to see them actually respect each other's contributions to the discussion was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. But that's what integration is: honoring differences, promoting linkages. So let's look at some of the circuitry of this. And Jean, does that help get to the issue of the self? When you could feel in the room, this 8th grade classroom, you could feel that the self was not just in a separate way. You could feel it. They might not have words for that. But if you don't have mind sight, which Roots of Empathy, I think, is promoting mind sight in a huge and experiential way, the best kind of learning is experiential learning, and Roots of Empathy just dives right into that. You can have a kid go through an attachment set of relationships, develop no mind sight. You can have them in schools where most schools don't develop mind sight at all. Awareness of one's inner life, awareness of the mental life of other people. And integration is respecting that another person's perspective is different from yours. There was one kid in the 8th grade class yesterday. It was unbelievable. He said, what Roots of Empathy taught me was that, I've got a lot of opinions. I got a lot of judgments. But it's taught me that even though I may have a judgment come up inside of me, when I look at another person who's not doing something the way I think they should do it or thinking the way I think, I've got to go, well, their perspective is just as valuable as mine. Isn't that what he said? You go, oh my God. Now the fact that Mary Gordon, trained him to say that, and it was all a setup. Where's Mary? No, I'm just kidding about that. It was so beautiful. Yeah, Josh.
So I like the idea of sight as a metaphor, and it turns out if you don't get visual stimulation when you're really young, you won't develop your sight.
Exactly.
So does it work the same way with mind sight? Or can you go through life without the Roots of Empathy experience and develop it later on?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I was in medical school, the person who taught me brain science was a fellow named David Hubel. And David Hubel, in 1981, when I was in school with him, won the Nobel Prize for proving just what you just said, that if you don't expose visual stimuli to, these were kittens, at a certain age, they can never develop that. In pediatrics, we knew this, if a kid had, opacities in the lens of the eye, and they couldn't see well, we had to do something within the first 2 years, or you messed up the brain for life. With mind sight, it's an interesting issue. And now let's get into the brain based on Joshua's question. I don't want to shock anyone, but once upon a time, there was a sperm and egg. Are we okay so far? And they get together, right? And the sperm and egg get together, and they form a single cell. The single cell forms 2, then 4, then 8, and 16, 32, 64, et cetera, until there comes a time when this glob of cells in the womb of the mother becomes so big that there's an interesting moment that affects the rest of existence, which is they begin to differentiate. Some cells are on the outside and some are on the inside, just because of the size. So we're going to keep track of that word differentiation. Differentiation just means making different, being special, being unique, okay? But they're linked because they're connected to each other, okay? So now, as this glob grows, the organs start growing and stuff like that, and an incredible moment happens, and put your hands together like this so you can see what this is like, where the outer layer of cells, the ectoderm, actually starts to invaginate. So if you move your fingernails inward, so your knuckles, first knuckles, and your second knuckles kiss like that, see where your fingernails now are? They're inside this body. That's the neural tube. That's going to become all the neurons which are going to make up the brain. So let's back it up and do it again. So the outer layer, called the ectoderm, is going to invaginate inward and become the nervous system. So to say it really in a simple way, neurons, the basic cell of the nervous system, are fancy skin cells. Now I say that because it's an important place to begin, because basically we think of the brain as inside the skull and the nervous system inside your body, but what's the purpose of the skin? The purpose of the skin is to interface the outer world and the inner world. But that's exactly what the nervous system is. So when we say the brain, this collection of neurons that cluster up inside the head, is the social organ of the body, it's just like saying the skin is the interface between the inner and the outer. Because these are fancy skin cells. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two is the way these basic cells of the nervous system are going to make connections with each other, synaptic connections, is by a process driven by two things. One is genes, not like Gene Clinton, but by Genes. Well, maybe that's the way you spell your name, but genes, chromosomes with DNA, and experience. And they go together in some interesting ways. The first thing to say to respond to Joshua's question is you have two kinds of genetically driven growth. One is called experience expectant growth. The other is experience dependent growth. So experience expectant growth is where every member of the species would expect you're going to have that kind of experience. So experience expectant. What does that mean? For Jude, we would expect light is going to come in his eyes. His mom is not going to stick him in a dark room his whole life. So light coming into eyes would be expected. So genes set it up so your visual system, which is primarily in the back of your brain, is going to grow independent of light, you see? It's going to start growing in the womb even. And then afterwards it's going to grow, grow, grow. Genetics is going to say, produce the visual system, produce the visual system. But if there's something wrong with his eyes, if that experience expectant, genetically driven set of circuits doesn't get the stimulation from the eyes, it will die away. And that's what David Hubel was able to show. So experience expectant growth is just what you're saying. If you don't get the stimulation at some point, it's going to be a problem. The second kind of genetically prepared growth is called experience dependent. So think about riding a tricycle. Not every kid on this planet is going to ride a tricycle. But you can learn to ride a tricycle. So the actual experience of being put on a tricycle and learning to do your tricycle riding, that's experience dependent. Experience is getting neurons to fire, and as your wonderful Canadian physician and physiologist Donald Hebb said, although he didn't really say it, but he said the essence of it, neurons that fire together wire together. That was actually Carla Schatz, a woman who is the neuroscientist at Stanford who paraphrased Donald Hebb. But it's called the Hebbian law. Neurons which fire together wire together. And there's a more elaborate thing that we can say, which is where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connection grows. And that becomes essential to understand the roots of empathy or even the tricycle experience. If I'm on the tricycle and now I'm paying attention to what I'm doing, where attention goes is getting my neurons to fire in a tricycle kind of way, right? So now I'm doing that. So where attention goes, neural firing flows. And here's what we've learned, and a Nobel Prize was given for this, which is when neurons fire, they turn on genes and get them to produce proteins to make the connections grow. So that's basically the mechanism beneath this idea of where neural firing goes, neural connection grows. In Roots of Empathy, you're getting attention on the mind. So it could be that while attachment may be an experience expectant system, so that, if you have 0 attachment figures by the age of 10, it may in fact be you can never really develop the capacity for close connections. That's some of what my colleagues in attachment are feeling. There's some window, because that's experience expectant. Mindsight may be a more experience dependent. That's the good news. So the window may not close totally. You want to do it earlier is better, But if you know the book Mindsight, I talk about a case of a 92-year-old person who had very little mindsight, and with some intervention, because he had an avoidant attachment history, he could develop those circuitries of compassion and empathy. So that's 92. So that's the way to understand it. For the attachment system in general, if you have someone who's had 0 attachment, it's not called an attachment category, it's an attachment disorder. But for people who've had attachment, even really traumatizing ones, you can grow through that. So a number of us were talking about the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. Michael and I were talking about this last night. You have this opportunity to think about that finding that early challenging events for some people can lead to really negative physiological outcomes, medical illness. But there's a certain percentage of people that it doesn't happen, and what those researchers didn't study was have those people where they don't have that negative outcome actually resolve those traumas, resolve those losses. Because in my field, attachment, we've shown in our research that you can have a horrible, horrible, horrible set of experiences. But if you've taken the time to make sense of them and resolve them, as that's what the research shows. That's why I wrote a book called Parenting from the Inside Out, which was to show you how to do that. You can actually show that, at least for the next generation, they are clear of what happened to you. So making sense is really important. How do you make sense? With mindsight. So this is why I think as a therapist, I never give up hope with developing mindsight. And that 92-year-old is a good example in that mindsight book. Okay, so now the brain is developing. Now, the Marys came in early this morning, and with that blue tape you use when you're putting stuff up, they've put a model of the brain as a handout for today's talk that you can take home. So if you reach under your chair, they've taped it under your chair. Reach under your chair, you'll see. Can you feel it? And then you pull out your hand, you'll see attached to your wrist is a hand. Does everyone have that? Let me check with Mary. Can they take this home? Yeah. Mary, is it okay with you to take it home? So this is your hand model of the brain. We're going to go through some neuroanatomy and neurodevelopment here. So you put your thumb in the middle, and you can all take this home. It's very useful. My daughter says, Dad, do not call it a handy model of the brain. So I didn't. I did not call it a handy model of the brain, but it's very handy, and it's a model. So let's go through this model, and we're going to look at the neurobiology of empathy and what I think is the neurobiology of resilience. But we have one of the world's experts on resilience who's here. You'll hear whether Michael agrees or not, but I'll give you my take on resilience as an attachment research person based on an interpersonal neurobiology view. So here's how it goes. The spinal cord is represented in your wrist. If you lift up your fingers and lift up your thumb, the deepest part of the brain stem, is represented here in the palm. And we teach this to teachers, to therapists, and kids in school as young as 5. Learn the hand model of the brain. It's very handy. The brain stem is here in your palm. The limbic area develops next, and it's in your thumb. How old is Jude? 4 months. Great. So when Jude was in utero, his brain stem developed very well and almost fully developed. Then his limbic area, let's say at birth, is partially developed. And one of the biggest things that's going to happen now to Jude at 4 months of age is the way his limbic area is going to continue to develop, and the very underdeveloped cortex, if you put your fingers over the top, will be developing, right? And the key thing for the whole notion is that you have the way this cluster of neurons, there's about 100 billion of them, will work together as a system. And the way a system works is it differentiates its areas and links them. What is this system all about? It's all about energy flow in the form of electrochemical energy flow. So it's ions flowing in and out of membranes called an action potential. You don't need to worry about that. That's the electrical part. It releases chemicals. That's the chemical energy part. But it's electrochemical energy flow. And these systems can become differentiated and then linked. So the word we use for that is integration. Here's the amazing thing about this development. And now, if you want to see the science of this, I wrote a textbook called The Developing Mind. If you just want the take-home messages, you can read a book called The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology. Or if you want to see how to do this with kids, there's a bunch of parenting books I've written, or books for adolescents. But the idea goes like this. The way, and can I have your first name, is that okay? Liz. So the way Liz is interacting with Jude can be promoting of relational integration or not. So remember, integration is the linking of differentiated parts. So as an attachment researcher, if I were popping in to watch Liz interact with Jude, it would be where I'm watching how their communication, for me, is revealing integration or not. How would they not be integrated? If there was no differentiation, then Jude might have in her mind, oh, he's probably, needing some stimulation now because I need some stimulation. And then she's going to bounce him around the room, but he's really just tired. So she's not differentiating his needs from her ideas. So that would be an unintegrated relationship. And that would be seen as a form of something that would cause ambivalent attachment to him. Or if there was a parent-child dyad where someone was getting their sexual needs met with a child, or was getting their anger needs met and beating a child, there wouldn't be differentiation. So those would all be various degrees of impaired integration in the relationship. Or there might be too much differentiation, and Liz might say, I'm just listening to this lecture. Jude's cool, he's 4 months, he can do it on his own. What's the problem? And she puts him off in the corner. And soon Jude would learn what's going on inside of me is not worth being seen by anybody else. And soon he would just shut down. And that's called avoidant attachment. Or if it were really severe, it'd be called neglect. But in a minor way, it's just a form of avoidance. That's a whole talk on attachment, but let's just say that that also would be too much differentiation and not enough linkage, right? So either way, impairments to secure attachment are impairments to integration. Now, an integrated relationship would be where you say, I'm feeling a little tired, so maybe I'm misinterpreting what Jude's things are going on, so I've tried jumping him around, but maybe I'm really not right. Oh my God, maybe he's hungry. No, he's not hungry. Oh, okay, it looks like he's really tired. He just needs to be soothed. So there would be, you would be making your efforts to repair any disconnection that happens. Repair is really important. Or if you flip your lid, you make a repair. But those ideas of connection with repair of ruptures are what we mean by an integrated relationship. So that's the relational side of it. The kids in Roots of Empathy are seeing that happen all the time, when both the mother and the baby and the facilitator and the mother and the baby are having these integrated relationships. They are demonstrating them for many kids who don't have that at home. So Roots of Empathy gives a powerful source of experiencing integration in a relationship. Now, here is the startling thing, and if you read The Developing Mind, especially the second edition, you'll see all the science behind what I'm going to say, because if I were you, never hearing anything Dan had ever said before, I would think this is ridiculous. And I would say to my interns, I had 15 interns work with me to revise the first edition of The Developing Mind, and I said to them, this is too simple, it can't be like this, it's too simple, it's not said anywhere else, so it's probably wrong. Let's discover the wrongness of it, find all the ways it's wrong, and let's write a new book that'll be more fun and more accurate. And they thought I was nuts. And I said, that's the way you have to do science. You have to look for the things as if they're wrong. Anyone could just nitpick one thing or the other and say, there, I'm right. So this comes from these 15 interns looking for all the wrongness of what I'm about to say. They could find nothing to disprove what I'm going to say, and tons of things to support it. Relational integration stimulates the growth of neural integration. That's take-home message number 2 or whatever we're at. When you have energy and information flow that's shared in an integrated way, it creates integration in the nervous system. Couldn't find one thing to go against that. A ton of evidence. Just look at The Developing Mind. I'm going to stop saying that. But because if I'm kind of relating to you and I'm looking at these faces and go, that's weird. I know it's weird, but remember, skull and skin are not boundaries, impermeable boundaries of energy and information flow. It's one system. Energy and information flow. Let's put ourselves in the Martian point of view. Energy and information flow, relationally, when it's integrative, just like we tried to carefully define it here, differentiated and linked, promotes integration of the brain. The next related take-home message is this, and I said to the interns, this can't be true, but here's the statement. All regulation comes from integration. I said, show me one thing that doesn't support that. They couldn't find one thing. When you regulate emotion, affect, mood, it depends on fibers in the brain that are differentiated and linked. When you regulate attention, differentiated and linked. When you regulate thought, behavior, when you regulate morality, when you regulate relationships, it all depends on integration in the brain. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, the corpus callosum linking the left and right hemisphere links the differentiated left to the differentiated right. The hippocampus, which links widely differentiated memory systems to each other. The prefrontal cortex. Take your hand model, and this cortex here has an area right behind your forehead, which is represented where your middle fingernails are. And let's look at what it links. It links the cortex, which is making representations or maps of the world, with the limbic area that has 5 features, which is all about working with the brainstem and the body to create emotion, working with the brainstem to create motivation, working within itself to create what's called appraisal. So you have emotion, motivation, appraisal. You've got systems that are basically involved in memory differentiation. That's a long story, we won't get into it, but it's involved in memory functions. And the 5th function is attachment, our close relationships with each other. So attachment, memory, appraisal, evaluating the meaning of things, motivation, what drives your behavior, and emotion are mediated by the limbic area. So this prefrontal cortex is connecting cortex with all those 5 functions. Then if you lift up your limbic area and go to your brainstem, the brainstem is involved in basic physiological processes like regulating heart rate and respiration and digestion. But in addition to that, it has the clusters of neurons called nuclei that are involved in the fight, flight, freeze, and faint response, what gets activated when you're threatened. So when we were talking yesterday about what was happening in Ireland or what happens in the United States or what's happening around this world, human beings are activating their threat response. They're activating their brainstem. Some people call it the old reptilian brain, right? Some people like to call it the lizard brain. It's part of us, so it's not just a lizard brain, but it's very, very primitive when you get in this fight, flight, freeze, and faint state activated by the brainstem. So this prefrontal region here is connecting cortex to limbic area to the brainstem, and even signals coming up from the body that we'll talk about in just a moment. And to boot, it connects the social world. So social, somatic, bodily, brainstem, limbic, and cortical are all coordinated and balanced by the prefrontal cortex. So what I'm going to say to you is that relational integration promotes growth of these integrative areas, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the corpus callosum. And now we know, through a set of reasoning, that this is a probably issue, but we have a new study called the Connectome study, the Human Connectome Project. Connectome is the word connect with the letters O-M-E at the end. It's a new way we're identifying differentiate areas of the brain and how they're linked. And we now know the following findings. Number 1, the work of Martin Teicher at Harvard University shows that the 3 areas I mentioned, prefrontal, hippocampal, corpus callosal, are all damaged with developmental trauma, which means abuse and neglect. We may be able to grow them, but I'm just identifying his work, which is not intervention work, it's just describing what happens. And the connectome is less interconnected, meaning the brain is less integrated with developmental trauma. So the reason kids with developmental trauma, abuse and neglect, have trouble with regulation is because regulation depends on integration. See how that works? And the integration in the brain comes from integration in the relationship, which is what Roots of Empathy teaches. You see this? Number 2, studies not related to experiences like developmental trauma. This is now the work of Marcus Rakel at the University of Washington, St. Louis, or Hillary Bloomberg at Yale University. What do those show? Those show that people with disorders like manic depressive illness, schizophrenia, or autism, not caused by what parents do, they have impaired integration in the exact same areas. So we have this finding now that psychiatric disorders, either experientially caused or not experientially caused, all have impaired neural integration. And then we have an online program, and one of our online students called us up in October 2015. And she said, hey, you guys, did you see this study that came out this morning? And we said, well, we're not sure. What is it? And she goes, I'm going to send it to you. So in October 2015, the International Human Connectome Project came out with this massive study of many, many, many individuals. They studied every measure of well-being you could measure and tried to find any neural correlates that predicted well-being. And they found one. How interconnected your connectome is, how integrated your brain is the best predictor of your well-being. So in terms of resilience and well-being, and you'll hear from Michael later about this in much more depth, my view is that resilience comes from integration. The ability to respond in a regulated way to challenges in life is how I would define integration. How I would define resilience comes from integration. That's what I think. Now, why would empathy have anything to do with this? And I know I have 5 minutes left, then we have a Q&A, right? Yes? So here's what I want to talk to you about and why people said I was saying the wrong thing about empathy, and why a Yale professor writes a book against empathy, and why Scientific American Mind said too much empathy is a bad thing. Because this is what's been happening the last, 3 years, 2 or 3 years. It's goofy. It's really goofy, and it's also destructive because they're missing the impact on society. And here's what's happening. So I'm on the stage with Tanya Singer. I said, Tanya, everyone's quoting you and telling me I shouldn't talk about empathy because of you. She goes, what? So what Tanya did in her study, to say it very briefly, was she puts a person in a scanner, shows them a photo of a really bad situation, and basically when people over-identify with the person in the car accident, let's say, they have so much emotional resonance and they're not differentiating themselves from others, their whole brain shuts down. And this is consistent with other studies that you'll see in that Decity book too. When you don't differentiate, when you're too linked, and you, quote, have too much empathy, this is where they're getting it from her study, that's not good. But what Tanya showed was that if you take it from excessive emotional resonance without differentiation, that's what I said to her. She said, absolutely. And take it to compassion where you say, well, that's not me, that's that person. What can I do to be of service to that person? She's actually creating integration. She's creating the differentiation that's needed. Empathy doesn't require you become the other person. So basically, the way I would summarize her work, with her permission, because this is what she said, was, yeah, when you resonate too much and you don't distinguish yourself from the other, you can burn out. No kidding. But empathy is so much more than over-identification. When you put perspective taking in it, your cognitive understanding, all the things we talked about. So I said, Tanya, is empathy bad? She goes, absolutely not. I said, Tanya, don't you need empathy for compassion? She goes, completely. There was one small group of monks from Tibet that they could do it on their own, but anyway. But in general, she said, you can't have compassion without empathy. So for someone to say, this is a quote from Tanya Singer, for someone to say empathy is bad is completely misleading. It's not bad. When you put the integration framework in, it makes sense. So let me just do I have 2 minutes? Yeah, let me just do a quick passageway of empathy in the brain so we can understand that. So here's your brain. Take your hand model. This is looking at Marco Iacoboni's insula hypothesis. And this, I think, is what deeply happens in Roots of Empathy that builds your mind-sight circuitry. So if you want to know about this, it's Iacoboni, Iacoboni, a colleague of mine at UCLA. He wrote a book called Mirroring People. And it's one perspective on the neurobiology of empathy, but it builds on a bunch of different people's views, so it's not like an outlier. But here's how it works. This boy is watching Little Jude here, okay? The energy and information coming from Little Jude is entering this boy, let's call him Joey. It's entering Joey's brain. It's being taken in by a set of neurons called mirror neurons, but if you don't believe in neurons, you don't even need this. It's basically soaking in what he's seeing in the non-verbal signals of another person. That's the crucial thing, those 7 signals. He takes them in. He can do a couple of things. Number one, and I can tell you all the areas if you want to know them in the Q&A, but basically he's mapping little Jude's intention, he's mapping his attention, and he's starting to create what's called simulation. He's going to drive what he takes in from little Jude, and it's going to go down from these cortical mirror neuron areas and the superior temporal sulcus, that biological motion area, map little Jude's intention, follow his attention, take his emotional state, drive it down through his insula, which is an area that goes from the cortical region down to the limbic region, the brainstem, and down into his body. He's going to feel in his body, that's what resonance is, what's going on in little Jude. Then the signals from the body come back up through lamina 1, layer 1 of the spinal cord, and the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve. Those things all push up in various ways to the insula, which takes this bodily state up into the middle part of this prefrontal region, the area we talked about right here. And the first thing it does is it maps out in Joey what's going on in my body. What am I feeling? And then right adjacent to that, he does this thing where he goes, if I'm feeling this is what I'm feeling, so that's called interoception, perception of his interior. Then just literally a hairbreadth away from that, it goes, gosh, if I'm having pounding in my chest right now and a churning in my stomach, I wonder if little Jude is feeling scared. So it's saying there's a simulation in my body that is not mine. It's from my perception. This is when you get burnout, when you don't do that. That's the burnout part. You got to say, oh, I see. I'm open to what other people are feeling because I've learned to distinguish my body is like an antenna. And because I feel another person's suffering, it doesn't mean I'm the suffering one. So if you're not taught this, yeah, of course you can get burnout. And what do people do? They just shut themselves down from other people's minds. You lose mind sight. So now, in this area right here, these are the mind sight circuits are right here, literally behind your forehead. You then go, oh, my body's feeling this. I wonder if little Jude is feeling that. And then you start developing all those layers of empathy right here. Empathy is, remember, a third of what mind sight is. Insight into myself, empathy for others, and I'm going to differentiate, but then link. So mind sight is insight, empathy, and integration. Roots of empathy is teaching mind sight skills, without even using that term perhaps, and what you're doing then is allowing Joey to massively integrate his brain. Mind sight circuits of insight, empathy, and integration literally are taking this area of the brain, linking cortex, limbic area, brainstem, body, and the social world into one. And you know what the outcome of such integration is? You know what integration made visible is? It's kindness and compassion. That's what's going to happen when we've taken the time to give programs like, let's say, Roots of Empathy, or relationships like actual Jude is happening with Liz. When we take the time to have integration in relationships and we develop integration in the brain, what you do is you can develop communities that are filled with kindness and compassion. People don't have to burn out. They can realize the self is a plural verb, that we are all deeply interconnected with each other. And I don't mean in some kind of airy-fairy way. I mean literally we are all interconnected. We are a part of energy and information flow that is happening not just now with all of these bodies that are alive now, but we are related to the ancestors that were here before on this land. And for people who will be in this building 200 years from now, when all of the nodes that are these bodies we live in are now gone, the system will continue, because the system is really the self. The system we're in is the self. And we have many, many nodes. And if you start living like that, life becomes bigger. Life becomes more connected. Life actually becomes more meaningful. So if meaning and connection are what you're looking for, and resilience and empathy and insight and having a more integrated life are what you're looking for, Roots of Empathy gives you the roots of how that can be created, because you're stimulating all this integration within and between. and think about having a world that can be kinder and more compassionate. Wouldn't that be a great world to live in and to leave for future generations? So thank you very much for your kind attention.